Don't call me Garno though.
No.
And say Jobin.
Okay.
Oh, you said it right. Excellent.
Not
Okay,
Jobin.
we are
Not
live.
Okay.
We're gonna give it a second just to let people get on board, just to let people log in. Maybe just before we actually start, I can showcase the merch I'm wearing today.
That's right. Stand up, stand
Let's
up.
Stand up.
Fortunately, I'm wearing pants in my home. So for any of you out there, I've been asking, you can, I guess, if you email, we can work something out in terms of getting one of these, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All sorts of colors. Pink,
all sorts of colors.
purple.
All sorts of sizes for babies. Yeah. Yeah.
For me.
What else do you want? Speaking of t-shirts, does everyone want to show their t-shirts?
Wow.
Shalene. That's right. Dream like Riel, inspire like Tantu, fight like Dumont, write like Campbell, resist like Belcourt, lead like Grant. Nice.
I love that.
And what does yours say?
The revolution has begun. It's a Christie report.
And I've got decolonize.
Self-explanatory.
Matching earrings. That's right.
I love it.
The whole merch day. Well, I guess everyone's here and watching. Welcome to, I feel like last week we said it was week 5 when it was week 6.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm confused whether we're on week 6 or week 7, but I think it's week
totally
7.
week 7.
Week 7. Time is just
7.
Time is fleeting. What is time? Week 7. So happy to be back. We're live this time again, so that's fun for everybody. We're back with Dr. Tracy Bear. We're back with Dr. Paul Garrow, and we have a very special guest, Dr. Shalene Jobin, joining us today. Dr. Shalene, do you want to introduce yourself and let everybody at home know why you're here?
Sure. Tansei Tawau, Shalene Jobin Natsigasun, Loretta Watani Nigawi Nehiao, Otsi Red Pheasant, Fred Jobin Palm Notawi Apitogasin, Otsi Big Prairie. So hi, so honored to be here today. My name is Shalene Jobin. I introduced myself in Upsis, the little bit of Cree that I know. I'm always practicing. I said my mom is a Watani from Red Pheasant Cree First Nation, where we're members in Treaty 6 on the Saskatchewan side. And my late father, Fred Jobin, was from Big Prairie in Northern Alberta. And I am an associate professor at the Faculty of Native Studies and director of the Indigenous Governance Program and co-lead of the Wokotowin Law and Governance Lodge.
Well, thank you for being with us today. And you were also featured in this week's lesson. So we're happy to have you. We're happy to have your insight. And what a week it was.
For sure. Lots happening outside the MOOC and also inside the MOOC too. Yeah. Lots to talk about, hey? Yeah, so it's super amazing to have Shalene Jobin on here. And as Paul says, everyone's favorite cousin.
Sure is.
So
don't tell my cousins.
Don't tell. Oh yeah. Don't tell anyone. You're my favorite.
Tell anyone.
So smudging today, we've got a very special smudge. And this is from Paul. He gifted this sage to me last week when we had dinner. And this is from Frog Lake. And so this is kind of what it looks like when you pick it. It's all dried now. So you pick it and then you hang it upside down and you dry it. And then to get the nice little round balls, this is what we do. We sort of pull up some leaves like that. And then you make it into a nice little ball like that. And so we'll use Paul's gift today to smudge. So thank you, Paul. Hi.
You're welcome.
Oh, it's a good one. Nice and dry. Oh, wow. And here to all our viewers out there, that we have a good conversation. There's some for Dan, a little bit for Paul, and so our guest Shalene, and for everybody out there. As we go forward with this conversation and discussion, I hope we have good thoughts and we speak good words in our time together. So, hi.
Hi.
All right. So this week, week 7, we're pretty sure it is week 7. Red Power. Red Power. So Dan, how did you do this week? What came up for you?
I did well, and I'm not just referring to the test in which I accidentally did not answer one of the questions, which really messed with my score, but that's a whole other conversation.
Jeez.
You know, I think what's becoming really clear about the way in which you've structured this course is that everything we learn helps to build a foundation for the next thing that we learn. And I think there's such a brilliance to the way that it's laid out and the way that we're kind of ingesting this information, because the history that we've learned over the first couple of weeks really led us into those next few weeks. And the information we learned in those next few weeks really added a foundational layer in terms of context, in terms of understanding, in terms of having a point of relation. And this week really felt like a foundational layer, getting a deeper dive into kind of the minutia of like law as it pertains to the Canadian government, and that I can only imagine moving forward will help with the context, laying that foundational layer for what we're about to learn in the next few lessons. So it's really been crucial and really been quite amazing for me to come into each week having this sort of arsenal of knowledge that is slowly being built, and understanding through what I'm learning that a lot of what I'm learning now has a deeper impact and a deeper context because of the sort of layers of knowledge that we're acquiring over the course of these lessons. So that was a really big sort of takeaway for me this week. And obviously, you know, I have questions like I always have, and we had a lovely discussion yesterday, sort of preparing for today's discussion. And it actually really kind of brought up some instincts in me that I think we'll talk about today, just, you know, even in, you know, in terms of the distribution of wealth, for example, and that kind of part of the lesson. And I guess that would be, to start with maybe one of my questions, that was a question that I had going back to the Haida and how the chiefs would redistribute wealth among the community. And it seemed like there was a hierarchy with which they would redistribute the wealth. And my question is, as someone who is sort of entrenched in a culture that is all about winning and is all about money, and it's everywhere we look, there's kind of the prioritization of money and things as status, reading that in terms of someone redistributing sort of wealth to a community, my question was that something that was just agreed upon by the entire community? How, I wanted to get a little bit more of an understanding in terms of how that works, because I think in our culture now, the concept of someone deciding based on a hierarchical system who gets what, etc., feels so antithetical to this sort of capitalist society that we're living in. So that's my sort of roundabout question for you, is what does that mean? And can we delve a little deeper into that area just to sort of contextualize what that meant?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you talked about how the modules sort of scaffold your knowledge on top of each other. And so when we start with the worldview, you know, we did talk about reciprocity, we talked about obligation and accountability as well in our cultures. And I think that's, instead of redistribution of wealth, what it means in a deeper sense is reciprocity. And so we're talking about the potlatch, of course, which was not just with the Haida, the Kwakwaka'wakw people had it, and Northwest Coast people celebrated this. And so it's a little bit misleading when we say in the MOOC that it is redistribution of wealth, which it is in a way, but more importantly, it was the idea of reciprocity and not being a person that kept things to yourself. When you redistribute gifts, you are making sure that everyone has a warm blanket, everybody is feasting, everybody's well fed and has shelter and things like that. So the more you gave, the more wealthy you were seen as being, the more a stronger leader that you were, more, to give everything away to, as some of the missionaries said, to the point of, financial ruin or devastation. Indigenous people didn't see it as that. They're like, we're just giving back, we're sharing. And so the purpose as well. So we see the potlatch ban happened for 67 years. And so people had this whole world view of being able to give gifts and share in the wealth that they had. But also it was important to witness. And so when we have Sundance, even now, for Cree people, a round dance, there's giveaways. So if I was to dance in a Sundance, I would be collecting and making gifts for about a year in order to bring the gifts there and then to give to the drummers, the elders, the ceremonialists, and the people who are witnessing, because I'm dancing maybe for my aunt who is sick. I want people to remember. I want people to see me there. And these gifts are sort of like this spiritual contract where I'm giving you a gift, we're feeding you, and it's up to you and it's your obligation to remember this. And so there was a part of witnessing that was really important. And so if you think about it, like many of the missionaries, and then of course the Indian Act who banned it, they thought of this as, holding on to old ways and not being a part of the capitalistic venture that our nation was sort of founded on in a way. Mm-hmm. And so taking away that from Indigenous people was a huge blow. Absolutely massive.
Yeah, and one of the things Tracy mentioned about witnessing, I think it also speaks to how historically we were oral societies. So you can think about how in oral societies, by having these systems of witnessing where your job is to remember, 10, 20 years down the road, you might be called to give an oration of what happened. And so that those kind of systems put in place the importance of remembering and being able to tell oral histories and genealogies of different people. And like Tracy said, the potlatch system is still going on today. We have many different giveaways for Plains peoples, giveaways that happen during the summer when there's when someone passes away, there'll be a memorial giveaway. There's wintertime giveaways, and they're also thought of as to bring life. And so by a certain one that I'm thinking about that happens in the wintertime, you dance the gift to someone and then they reciprocate and dance a gift back to you. And so within that system, you're renewing relationships with each other, you're renewing relationships in the spiritual realm as well, and building that community. And one of the other really interesting things that happened and that we learn about this week is how you have all these really complex systems of governance that are diverse across Turtle Island, North America, and Canada, with different nations, whether that's the Haudenosaunee, the Inuit, the Nehiawak, the Cree. But then you also have the federal government under the Indian Act putting a band council system onto all First Nations people across Canada. And so under the band council system, you elect your chief and council. But then what you see is these complexities where you have these traditional forms of governance that are still in play, plus this band council system that's put on top. And so today, there's some complexities about how those two governance systems work for different Indigenous nations.
Yeah. Yeah, well said.
Just listening to you both at this point, it's such a if we could all kind of recontextualize wealth based on how much you give back
Mm.
versus how much you get. I mean, there's so much that just becomes so illuminated through these discussions. And, you know, you're looking at billionaires, you know, in America who have made more money in the time of COVID than they ever made outside of it. And you're asking yourself, well, is that wealth in this context? It absolutely is not, because the give back isn't there. So I just think, I hate to kind of stop and interject in these moments, but, you know, as someone who's learning, you realize how meaningful these kinds of conversations are in recontextualizing and reclaiming what certain words can mean. And the idea that wealth be defined by how much you give back and not how much you get is really powerful.
Yeah. And leadership being defined by how much you give away. And you know, same with the Cree. If you were an Okinawa leader, that was the main expectation, is that you give away, you provide for the people in your community. So yeah, it does really shift how we think about things.
Completely. Well, you just you know, you just are reminded how so many of us are deeply kind of caught up in the wheels of capitalism. You know, that you are trained to just assume that status means how well you're doing and how much you're getting and how much money you're earning, when in actuality that really kind of, in the wake of this conversation, means very little. If the footprint that you're not offsetting in terms of what you're getting versus what you're giving back isn't there, then what exactly is this presumed status that people are questing for? It's really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that the potlatch was banned, but, you know, it never really went away like many of our ceremonies. You know, it sort of went underground. But one of the things I feel like I need to mention in this is the idea that the government banned it. And so when they did still have a potlatch and they were caught, you know, they were threatened with jail time. But the government bargained with the leaders and said, you know, we'll reduce your jail time sentence if you just hand over these ceremonial objects. And so in order to keep their people out of jail, which we didn't ever really do well in jail, to keep the people, they'd give over these objects. And so for, you know, 67 years, the government collected all of these things, sold them off to museums, sold them to private collectors and places like that. And then once the potlatch ban was done in 1951, you know, we still, I think in the Indian Act, we still weren't able to access lawyers at that point. We weren't able to hire lawyers to fight for us in court. But in the 1970s, the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, they actually started to hire lawyers, and they want these things back. Obviously, they want their ceremonially sacred items back. So they went to court, and the government said, yeah, okay, you can have them back, but you have to prove to us that they were stolen, and you have to have the right facilities. If we were going to give them back, you have to have the right facilities for them to be given back to you. So they had to build these amazing, you know, these museum quality places for their sacred items to come back. And that goes back to what you were saying about totem poles yesterday, Shalene.
Yeah, and so some of these ceremonial items, some Indigenous nations might want a museum, and that's great, but sometimes that goes against the teachings of how those ceremonial items are supposed to go back to the earth and the cycle that happens. And so being forced to do things in a certain way sometimes go against those teachings of how they're supposed to go back into the natural world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just want to say, like, this is at the end of hearing all this, we see, like you said, Dan, this is all building up. In the next module, we'll be talking about Dalgamuk and like an important court case that was built on this like long knowledge of Wet'suwet'en, you know, understandings of territory and self and stuff. So it's like all of these relations are really key and core to how Indigenous governance works. And I always, every time I think about zombies, I always think about like this like land of broken relations and possessiveness. Like to possess a totem pole, to possess all of these ancestors. It's like this white possession, and like all of these zombies and soulless people walking across the landscape. And it's really like this work that we're doing of reconnecting and reestablishing good relations with good governance structures is very important for everyone, right? For not for settlers, non-Indigenous people, and Indigenous people.
Redefining what wealth really is, right?
Exactly.
And wealth is good relations.
And redefining what I mean, the concept of taking something from someone and then only giving it back if that object is treated with a certain level of care that the person who took it is expecting is so nuts and speaks so much to this ongoing conversation about we need to reprogram the concept of presuming things on other people's behalf. It's not the government's responsibility to ensure that certain artifacts are well kept, because they clearly, to what Shalene was saying, and often in many cases, don't even understand the purpose of those objects to begin with. So it is this presumption among sort of settler mentality that like, well, we know best in some way. And it is so backwards, and it is so, I mean, it only becomes exacerbated in these conversations because they're, you know, in the context of what we're learning, it only looks more and more kind of, I mean, it's a terrible thing, but it's also ridiculous looking. Like it's just ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah.
It makes me think I don't like going to museums very often because I want to touch everything and I want to just be up to it and smell it and like be on it. And they're like, get away.
It makes me now wonder every time you go and see an exhibit that happens to involve Indigenous artifacts, are we looking at these artifacts, or are we looking at these objects as they were intended to be viewed? Which becomes a whole other conversation that I think is so valuable for people in these discussions that we're having to take away is the concept of what exactly are we looking at? And how are we looking at it? And that is a prime example in a very sort of almost sort of like an analogy, if you will, for just, we go to a museum, we think we're looking at something, when in actuality we might be doing that, the act of observing that object might be the polar opposite of what that object was intended for. So this is just
totally. And to pull it into this week, another example would be bundles. And Indigenous societies, for example, Blackfoot, Cree societies would have bundles that they would have certain roles and responsibilities, and holding on to a certain bundle also was part of what your role in your society was. So these bundle holders had responsibilities to the bundle, but also it played into the governance system of the people. But all these bundles have been taken by museums all over the world and are in these, but for the people that they've been taken from, you're not able to live out your responsibilities to that bundle if it's at a museum in this case. And there's certain feasting that has to happen, certain protocols that have to happen, which then negate the governance system, but then also negate your relationship and your role in society, that you're not able to play that anymore.
Yeah, that's a good addition. Yeah.
I had another question before we get to the audience questions this week, and it had to do with when we were sorry, I'm taking over the questions for a minute.
He's teasing you, means he likes you.
Audience questions, but this week I had some questions. It was in the discussion of the Inuit. When it came to the selection of the community leader, it said they chose the community leader based on skills, i.e. hunting, warfare, oratory, spiritual gifts. And my question was, what would spiritual gifts be defined as?
So this is strictly from a Cree person and my teachings. And so the spiritual gifts would be a very clear, deep understanding of our worldview and our teaching. So we have certain teachings that we live by: humility, love, respect. There's 12 of them. And so you build as you become a leader or a spiritual person, ceremonial, you would build on that. And so you would offer gifts, you would offer things in order to get that knowledge. And then you would have this knowledge and you would share it and you would embody it. So it wasn't just something like the 10 commandments that you'd spout all the time. You would actually embody these teachings. And so spiritually, you would be wealthy in that way, but you wouldn't keep them. And so people would respect a person that had gone out of their way to really look at what these teachings were, to really find out what they meant, and then to embody them as well. And so it's not something that you can just espouse. It's something that you really had to show in your actions as a leader. And so you were well respected in that way.
Yeah. Another thing that comes to mind is a story that I heard during a time of famine for the Plains people, that one of the leaders had a dream of where to find buffalo. And so that dreaming, that ability to dream, was one of the spiritual gifts. And so in that dream, he was told where to lead the people to find buffalo. And so he did that, and they didn't starve. And so that would be an example of a spiritual gift. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is thinking about leadership and different forms of governance and how leaders come to be. And so also on the Plains, there was sometimes a wartime chief and a peacetime chief. And so for me, that's really interesting because it talks about a contextual form of leadership where, determining what the situation in the world was, people with certain gifts and leadership styles would then be asked to stand up and exhibit that leadership style. And I think that's something really interesting, even thinking about leadership today, how to be good leaders and how to choose our leaders, and different circumstances require different types of leadership skills.
Yeah, I mean, it was, the concept of leadership is another sort of through line through this. I think this lesson that really stood out to me is having parallels, and the idea of, I think it was the Native People's Caravan, and what was taken on, that kind of march to Ottawa, and then to be met with the police brutality. Just in terms of leadership, it comes to my mind that there's really, the concept of police has always had kind of a very problematic track record throughout history, and the silencing of certain leaders and leadership as voices tried to, and it tried to be made. I don't know. The parallels keep coming up in terms of just the concept of how they were met with police brutality. These people who were trying to just get their voices heard, and yet for apparently no reason, not that there even needed to be a reason, they were met with, violence from police before they even got to speak to somebody. And it does. I mean, in my head, I'm just thinking, this is exactly what we're seeing on the news every day, is the intervention of the police, which then opens up a whole larger conversation, obviously, as we're having, about what is the police? Is it the right form of protection at this point? What does it all mean? And yeah, it's sort of, that was sort of, I mean, the connections are always being made as we talk, and drawing those parallels, it just felt like we need to let people's voices be heard. Otherwise, we're moving into a really dangerous, as we've seen in the past, it's a dangerous form of repression.
Yeah. And I think you hit the nail on the head with that, like, protection for whom? What are we protecting, and who are we protecting?
And when we look at the history of, let's say, the RCMP and when it was created, part of the reason why Canada created it was to clear land for settlers from Indigenous peoples and Indigenous bodies. And so, yeah, I think it's important to really, really pull apart some of the start of how these policing functions started, and really question what Tracy said: who are we protecting them from? And are we othering a certain people group or certain bodies in a certain way that othering is causing really systemic violence to happen? And how do we think about these things around good relations and not othering certain bodies?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. I think a good lesson is learned from "We Will Stand Up," the documentary by Tasha Hubbard and Jade Brown, because it's in that film that we see the sort of genealogy of injustice when it comes to like how the legal system works in Canada. Right, it was never intended to work for Indigenous people. It was always intended to work for settlers, and that's the system that we're always sort of really working against, I guess. And like the economy, banking, like all of these flashpots of where Indigenous people are in the news are all these instances where Indigenous people are asserting self-determination, right? And it's like, so the system is trying to redress itself, and people are buying into it. Like the violence that happened in Red Deer, it informs also a BIPOC experience. Like, why are people beating up anti-racist protesters? What are they defending? What's the economy they're defending? There's a lot to be questioned about. Why are these Proud Boys so proud? And why are they doing it this way? It's a long-standing systemic issue, a genealogy, right? So yeah, to start thinking about it more critically, and I guess that's what we're doing, right?
Yeah. So we have this invisible person to the audience, who is Sarah, who is basically one of our producers. She works at the faculty. And when we have these discussions, she always has these brilliant insights. So we're going to have her on the show very soon so people can see her face. But Sarah yesterday mentioned the illusions of the radical 60s and these notions that we have of progression, but these things that are still happening, as Paul mentioned in Red Deer. But this is also part of the BIPOC experience as well, material and structural reality to their jobs. Paul, did you want to say a little bit more about the Red Deer thing that happened, just in case people aren't following along?
Yeah, I don't know if I know all the details because my brain is a sieve because I'm a dad or something. But there was an and this is Alberta too, right? Like, Alberta is about, and just like everywhere in Canada, there's racism and flashpoints of racism. And right now with COVID and stuff, the flashpoint is around the economy. So before COVID hit, there was a lot when there was Indigenous resistance and around water protectors and land defenders at CN sites. There were these guys who came in and pushed these Indigenous protectors out of the way, right? And so it's these flashpoints. And in Red Deer last week, there was a anti-racism walk demonstration, and these white men came in and spread some violence to push against it. I don't know, were they pro-racism? It's like, when we think about it and we start to question it, we're like, what are they doing? They're pro-economy. Economy means what? It's about white privilege, and it's about privileging a system. And it's so, I always think back to We Will Stand Up, and that cartoon, that sort of animation at the start, where was it 8 men that were executed in North Battleford, and they were like, okay, well, we will get lawyers. It's like Indigenous people right away. It's like, yeah, we will do what needs to happen. And the government's like, no, you can't do that. You can't do this. You can't do this. You can't have your own. It's like all of these impediments are to enfranchise. That's what matters most. But it never works. So it's like Indigenous people are constantly able, and they have the capacity to change and make things happen, but it's always these roadblocks, and it's like implicit and explicit. And it's, with the more you look at this MOOC and the more you investigate it, it's incredible, really incredible how deep it goes.
Yeah, the Indian Act is the ultimate roadblock if you think about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Shay, what do you think?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind, Paul said the good boys, and I just saw today there's a
Proud Boys,
Instagram
yeah.
movement of two-spirit gay people challenging what the good boys are on Instagram with pictures.
Yes.
And I thought that was just such a beautiful thing to that, Paul, you brought up, but just to think about how we resist, and that in those ways that we resist, it can shift the discussion and the paradigm. And I thought how beautiful that these men are showing Sagituin, love, and that's how the resistance is happening through this lens of love. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to that.
I saw a really cool
those
meme.
too. Yeah, they were
Yeah.
they were gorgeous. So it's they're taking over the hashtag Proud Boys, which is what this, anti-racist group is. Like, they're fighting against anti-racism, whatever.
I don't know if this,
And we know what they're fighting for, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So you've got these beautiful gay men in these really seductive, provocative poses, like the famous kiss, I just loved them. They were beautiful. So yeah, this is resistance, and it's subverting the message. And there's so many different ways that water can move, and water will always get through. It eats away iron, rock, so I always think of our people very much like water, and that resistant, and it doesn't matter what happens, it will always get through, dams don't last forever.
And how beautiful to speak against hate through the message of love.
Yeah.
Sagituin.
Yeah.
So important. It's like such a powerful message, and speaks to hopefully what what will shine through all of this is the strength of love and community. And we had talked, yesterday about the sense of community, that strength of community, and, in the lesson as well, the concept of, taking a step back from the constant battle of resistance and realizing that there is power in strengthening the sense of community. That was a huge takeaway for me in this lesson too, was just that conversation around, we're weakening our community, constantly pushing back. We have to also spend time relearning our own histories so that we can have that power back, because the concept of enfranchisement, from what I'm sort of learning through these lessons, is kind of the removal of culture. So the biggest retaliation to that from what I'm reading seems to be, and from history and from all sort of minority cultures, seems to be the kind of protection, incubation, and growth of history, of culture, the importance of culture from within the culture, and let that kind of push out. Because, battling oppression is incredibly tiring, and it can take up your entire life. I mean, that was a really sort of, again, a powerful takeaway from the lesson, was that philosophy of strengthen yourself.
And I love how Shalene's putting in these amazing Cree teachings, like Saki is love. That is one of our teachings, respect is one of our teachings. Humility, which I work on a lot. Humility is one of our teachings. Me too. So that is the brilliance of what Idle No More was for me, to bring these round dances. And our round dances are done in the winter, and it's among many things, it's got whole teachings around it, but it's bringing community together and strengthening those bonds that you have, those kinship bonds, celebrating. Lots of round dances have like a gift exchange as well. You dance with it's amazing and beautiful, and you hold hands with people, and you dance in a circle, and it doesn't get any simpler than that in that very simple act, which we're missing out really badly right now. But the flash mob round dances with Idle No More happened all over Canada, and I remember being in West Edmonton Mall, this big capitalistic sort of area. My mom wanted to go, and okay, let's go to West Edmonton Mall.
Everyone does.
And then all of a sudden this giant round dance flash mob started, and she was so thrilled, like the pride in her eyes. She was just like transfixed, you know, to have this huge mall just taken over by all of these Indigenous and non-Indigenous people coming together with love and respect to say we're here and we will be idle no more. It was brilliant.
And the beauty of that is that people are coming together and saying, no, we don't want this, and resisting, but also saying what we do want. And so within that, reclaiming Indigenous drum songs, doing the round dance, taking over space and showing Indigenous presence in a really beautiful and community building way. And I think that's really powerful, is it creates kind of the future that we want to live and we want to be, and also, you know, including relations. So it wasn't just Indigenous people doing those round dances. We were inviting non-Indigenous people into those circles to do that with us. And I think it's so powerful to see movements like that.
Yeah. Again, a grassroots movement started by 3 Indigenous women and one non-Indigenous ally, you know, just
from PA.
round up.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, those are great questions, Dan. And you know, Paul's just teasing you because he likes you, right?
Yeah, good questions, Dan.
Once
The
we
best.
get to know people, we really start teasing them because that's how we show our love.
Yeah. I expect, you know, if I ever ask a really stupid question, for you to say next.
That's it. So rude.
Pass.
Pass on that one. Go back to question 6 and relearn it.
What's your favorite color?
Yeah.
So we do have some questions from some learners out there. Cyrus says this week's module seemed noticeably more hopeful. It's great to see Aboriginal people gaining recognition, self-governance, self-determination. How well has the Canadian government kept up their end to recognize Indigenous rights to self-governance and self-determination? My guess is not well. Who'd like to take that one up? Let's give the government a report card. Go, Shalene.
F minus.
Needs improvement.
Yes. So the Red Power movement, and Red Power is what we called this module. And just a shout out to the late Vine Delorier, who was an author and an activist and a scholar from Standing Rock Sioux people in the US. And he really, in the 60s, started writing. He wrote this book, Custard Died for Your Sins, and really kind of talked about the importance of Red Power, of Indigenous power, and that theme has gone around Turtle Island to talk about the importance of these movements. And we can see this week we learned about the 1969 white paper on Indian policy, and then we saw this resistance movement with the red paper and all these other movements across North America in response to that. And the Canadian government at that time, it was really a policy of assimilation, that Indigenous peoples had to become like non-Indigenous peoples, like white society, and that was the policy. And so there's this resistance against it. And then, but since the Indian Act came into play, you can see these moments of that kind of pull of assimilation happening in different ways. And I think there's been the realization that that doesn't work. And so in 1995, the Canadian government developed the Inherent Right on Indigenous Self-Government Policy, and talking about that, and Indigenous peoples really saying we have an inherent right to self-determination, that we were Indigenous peoples on these lands before the Canadian state was created. And so we have this inherent right and these roles and responsibilities to these lands. And so there's different things that are happening, like modern day self-government agreements that have been negotiated, and some Indigenous peoples are really struggling because they say that the government gets to decide what's in that box of self-government, and so there's this tension of is that the realization of what real self-determination means for Indigenous peoples? And so then you see this tension against it, but then you see kind of like what Dan said a few minutes ago, you see also communities saying, okay, let's also focus on rebuilding from within. So let's focus on learning beading, let's focus on our language, let's focus on traditional food harvesting and growing our own foods and land-based camps. And so there's this really interesting Indigenous resurgence that's also happening that really takes the eyes, as Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard says, off the state and focuses it internally with us of what we can do today that we don't need the government's approval to do. We can just live those teachings and teach and learn the language and all those really things that can be really generative and really healing.
Right on.
Well put. Yeah, absolutely.
Nice.
Paul, anything to add to that?
Just thunderstruck. Holy Shalene. I love it. I love when our guests come on. I'm like, wow, it's so good.
Yeah, right.
Because I think I'm so happy about Coulthard in, because I think it's like, we have to decenter a lot of this like imposition of state and imposition of all these things. And Dan's pushing on this, and I love it, because it's just like, why are we always centering whiteness? Why are we centering white supremacy in these discussions and BIPOC discussions? Like my wife and I, Lucy, we do a form of playback theater, which is like improvisational theater where we ask, stories and play back, but we're very political and we're very identity engaged and critical race theory stuff. And we're always like, we have to go back into our B and our I and our POC spaces to then come back together to then engage into white society, because there's so much, like, I guess it has to do with privilege, but there's so much, it takes up so much space, like whiteness does, right? So, and that's the disbalance that we're always affirming. And for Indigenous people, I think it's like, as a Métis, for me, it's like, why I have to go back to my relations and hear those stories of relations all the time. And my other cousin, Cindy Gannett, does amazing work in St. Louis, Saskatchewan with our relations, hearing those stories from Métis elders and bringing it back into our consciousness so that we have the strength to then encounter people who, the other peoples out there, human and more than human. And I wanted to show you this little thing too. Just as a side for like Métis things, this is a sash. Métis love their sashes because we can drape it on ourselves and look beautiful. And this is a black sash, which is, there's a lot of different teachings about the colors, but I love the sash because the black represents the dark period of Métis fragmentation and the fragmentation of our, not being recognized as a form of white supremacy, right? Not recognizing our sovereignty, our self-determination, our political self-determination, right? So I would love having this prominent to remember that this doesn't define me. I can move forward and be stronger because I remember, so, and I'm just so happy to hear Shalene talk about, like, this is not the end. We're not defined by its centering whiteness. We're defined by being in relation with each other, in good relations with each other, right?
And always having that offering open to non-Indigenous people as well. There's so many instances where you're just opening up. I mean, for Dan, opening up this platform and then us being here is also a part of Indigenous sovereignty when we have, these scholars coming on and sharing, taking their time out and then sharing. That is a huge part of Indigenous, I guess, worldview, is not to keep things to ourselves. Like, when you get those teachings, then you share them, you embody them and you share them. So, even this is that kind of reciprocity in giving back from Indigenous scholars. So, yeah.
Thanks, Dan.
No, listen, I was just, in discussion of what you were saying about the piece you just held up. I think there's something so powerful, again, about what it stands for. I mean, quite literally weaving in a dark part of your history into the culture and in a way using that as something to create something beautiful out of. It's and then you get to wear, you get to actually wear it.
Yeah.
You get to own it. You get to wear it and own it with a sense of pride that is not sort of falling victim to the darkness, but rather harnessing it and making it your own for a stronger kind of thrust forward. It's amazing.
I'll send you one, Dan.
This is actually a question that I would say I have been embarrassed to ask, but if we're learning anything through these discussions, it's that this is a safe space, and I suppose there's no stupid question until I ask it.
Nope.
But I think, and we've talked in a small part about this as well, about the commodification of Indigenous peoples and cultures and cultural objects. And so I guess my question is what can settler people buy? To be quite frank about it. I mean, what, because I know that I would hope that I'm not the only one that's getting the more we learn, the more I think we realize how everything has meaning beyond what we've been sort of raised to just assume is something we can own as well. So not to interrupt this, but I do feel like it's been bubbling up inside in terms of all of these different instances where we're talking about objects or things that can be worn, or the concept of a moccasin. We talked about the Hudson's Bay blanket. What does that really mean? What does it mean when we buy it? And not to go too off course, but I would love to know your stance on what settlers can buy. What does it mean when we buy certain objects, and what is a philosophy, or what should we be keeping in our minds when we are thinking about buying something? Does that make any sense?
Oh, totally. And it's not a dumb question.
Through the question because you can, I mean, it's a strange one to ask, but one that I think is really important, because like the words that we're learning to use, when we're spending money on things, when we're buying things, I think it's equally as important to understand what we're buying, why we're buying it, and what it means when we buy it.
Yeah.
Right on.
Should I let our guest take a crack at it? Is that fair?
I hope she's on this side of my screen.
I mean, give Paul and I some time to think. We'll let you.
We'll just leave and then come back.
Sorry, this is not part of our discussion.
No, that's cool. It's a good question. I think a lot of people might be thinking that.
If you want to take some time, we can come back to it if that's a better way to go about it. Because I wouldn't want to.
I think one of the things that comes to mind is that when I teach an Indigenous economy class, and one of the things that we teach in the class is that there's this concept of the amount of time a dollar gets recirculated in a community, it's able to ensure that economy is expanding and growing in a good way. And so we could see about supporting Indigenous artists, Indigenous companies, Indigenous designers. There's so many beautiful beaters that are out there that helps. For example, I co-taught a course where we learn traditional tan hiding practices with elders in a community of Assiniboine Nation, and it was just so beautiful to see the amount of work and time it takes to create the home tanned hide that moccasins can be made from. And so you could see we have an alumni. She has this beautiful jewelry company, J Shine Design, and so she buys the hide that these elders and community members make. So she buys that hide, and then she makes earrings from it. And then by us buying those earrings, that's not only creating a livelihood for her and her family, but also those elders that are living on the land and creating that livelihood in a good way. And so we can see how historically we had trade routes throughout North America of where we would trade for different goods between Indigenous nations, and that those trade routes can still happen today. And non-Indigenous people being conscious of buying from Indigenous designers, Indigenous people, that it's they're going through the process and the protocol of what designs can be put out there in a good way. And so that's one thing to be aware of, is sometimes we'll hear about cultural appropriation, and really where that's coming from is where a company is not going through that process of working with an Indigenous designer and taking something from a nation that maybe shouldn't be put on a t-shirt or shouldn't be put in a certain way. But if you're working with Indigenous communities and Indigenous companies and organizations that are doing that work, then, for example, even the shirt that I have from Christy Belcourt, that was raising funds for their on the ground work of language revitalization and walking with our sisters and different on the ground movements. And so, Dan, you can see how even asking the question, being self-conscious about all of us and where we're buying from and how we're connecting to those economies can really lift people up in a really good way. And it's just like with any purchase, being conscious and in an ideal world, having those relationships. So the more we have relationships, the more we can connect with that. Go ahead, Dan.
So then, for example, I think the most common thing that people gift and people buy are moccasins and dream catchers. So, would that be considered part of culture that should not be necessarily consumed, or is that part of like an artisan that we can support?
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. Okay, so let's take moccasins for example. There's really amazing people that are small-time business owners that we could connect with to buy their homemade moccasins. That would be an amazing way to support their family. And the only time where I might be a little bit like push someone on it is if they were buying moccasins from a non-Indigenous company, where then you're not supporting that Indigenous community with that money. So I would say trying to buy Indigenous would be amazing and would be a great way to support Indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
I think that's great.
So in the art world, when you have a painting, like say the Jerry Whitehead I have behind me, if I was ever to sell it, which I wouldn't, probably give it away, but if I was ever to sell it, what art collectors would want to know is, I think the word is provenance, their history of it, who made it, where did you get it, when did you buy it, and all of this thing. And so we understand that in Euro-Western ideas of art. And so we need to take the same care when we buy Indigenous art as well. And crafts, like I feel like moccasins are more like an art than a craft, but so take due diligence and look at where the company's from. And there are even companies who, non-Indigenous owned companies who are using Indigenous Northwest Coast designs, and they say, well, my wife's Indigenous, but she has nothing to do with the company. And so you really need to take due diligence in seeing where these products are coming from. I'm not sure any Indigenous people still make green catchers. Maybe they do. It's become really kitschy. You can buy them on ferries, so I'm not sure if
that was my question, is I feel like, when you can walk into a gift shop and you see something that seems to be tied to culture that is not in any way related to the random, gift shop that you happen to walk into, and then you buy it. I can't imagine that being respectful to the communities, and which is why I think it was it's an incredibly kind of naive question to ask. But one that I think only helps to shape how we spend our money and where we spend it. And I think the big takeaway is make sure that if you want a pair of moccasins, that you are sourcing it from someone where your money will go directly to funding more work.
Mhm.
It's not a dumb question because we're centering that in the way we're dressed today. Like we're specifically dressed. This is a Clinton Desjardins original. He does this up the river t-shirt company in Edmonton, and I love his work because it's like super political. It's hilarious. Like I bought my son Pretty Fly for a Tagay, which is a super fun Cree joke. You know, so it's just like my kids walking around with this thing and everyone's like, oh my god,
I can't believe you said that.
And it's so much fun. Know where it comes from, wear it with pride, you know. And but people see this, they're like, oh my god, is that Clinton? And they know it, you know. So I think one thing I just want to add to this is that it's really understand your privilege and how you possess things. You know, if you're possessing relationships in a non-consensual way, it's the same thing for objects and people, you know, like think about consent, right? Like that's a good way of relating to people is that if you have a consensual reciprocal relation. If your t-shirt doesn't have consensual relations with you, you've got a problem.
Excellent. That's
that
amazing answers. Yeah, perfect.
Do we want to do one more question? I sort of skewered
oh my gosh
conversation, but we will get to these questions, and I do feel like we will find ways of working more of these conversations in. Do we want to pick one more for the day, and then we can?
Oh yeah.
So
the
many.
last one.
The last one, Carolyn.
Yeah.
And
no, from Grom.
And Marielle.
Oh, Miriel, yeah, that's right.
I'll let our guest speaker pick because we only can do one, Shalene.
Okay. Okay. So I guess some things that have happened this week is there's been the resistance and the important mobilization and needing to honor and stand against racism and structural racism and discrimination and violence. And one thing what that happened with Joyce Echaquan and just our hearts and our love go to her family and just the importance of us dismantling structural racism that happens in hospitals, that happened in how we would hope a place that cares for people in a place that's supposed to be healing wouldn't be a place where there would be such overt racism and discrimination. And I think, education is so important, and learning and trying to understand that and really name when structural violence happens and how important it was. And yesterday there was a huge march in Montreal to send our love to the family and also to stand up against and say there needs to be change that happens. Also today is October 4th, which is the Sisters in Spirit National Vigil. And so people are lighting candles to honor missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit people. And there's events happening across North America. We know some people that walked on Highway 2 from Red Deer to Calgary over this weekend to bring awareness to missing and murdered Indigenous people. And so I think it's so important in these moments that we're having these important discussions and that we all want to have Neo Pamatsuan, the good life, that Indigenous peoples, when we negotiated treaties, that we were inviting non-Indigenous peoples to live in these lands as kin. And so there's certain roles and responsibilities that we all have. And Dan, you having this platform is really standing in your own and living up to that side of that treaty relationship. And Neo Pamatsuan means the good life. And so oftentimes it's been the good life for Canadians at the expense of Indigenous peoples. And what we want to do is have the good life for everyone. So Joyce can go to the hospital and receive care and not what she experienced, and hopefully raising that and that Indigenous women can feel safe on these lands, and Two-Spirit people can feel safe on these lands. And so, yeah, I think I'm just so proud of Dan, your work, and the work of the people that are listening and taking this course. And you know, our hearts are in the right space, that we just want to create a better tomorrow.
Oh, Shalene.
I will also share, there's a GoFundMe that's been set up for Joyce that I'll tweet about when this is done. And there's obviously larger conversations to be had. I'm sure we can continue this conversation down the line as the news comes out about what's actually going to be done. Because as of now, you know, firing people is not enough. It doesn't say enough, and the actions don't speak enough to the experience. So I'll post the GoFundMe if you feel like supporting, if you can, if you have the means. There's an extraordinary amount of money that's been raised at this point, which is really kind of, you know, a light if you can find one in and around this news story. But
so Sarah once again has her voice here. I think it'd be nice to say that settlers need to take this to heart, not just stories about Joyce, but also the resiliency that comes from that, and the participation in as much as you can do, from the march to supporting Sisters in Spirit to, you know, the GoFundMe, all of these little things, you know, as Indigenous people and scholars with, you know, who are visible, you get asked that quite a bit. What can I do? But there's so many different opportunities for people to participate, even if you're just going to a round dance and you're scared because there's a lot of Indians in there, and I can see why you might be scared. But, you know, to open yourself up to that, open yourself up to being vulnerable, to donating in whichever way you can. So, you know, just listening to any of these shows, there's 1,000 different ways that you can support, that you can move forward with your own education, that you can move forward and being a part of Canadian culture that does include Indigenous people in really good ways, you know. Do you think, Paul, that you might want to read that piece?
Yeah, well, everyone's favorite poet, the best poet in the world, Marilyn Dumas. Do we have time for me to read a piece? Dan?
Of course.
Shalene? You, Tracy? Huh?
Yeah.
So this is from, can you read that? It's from A Really Good Brown Girl. And Marilyn is the best because she's a fighter. And here she is, the very good brown girl. She's super cute. So if everyone should read this book of poetry and read Marilyn's poetry, because it's really good. And I'm gonna just read a letter to Sir John A. Macdonald, or as we lovingly call him, Jam. So the Métis, everyone has a relationship with Jam. Some people love Jam, some people hate Jam. The Métis have a very particular reason to not like Jam too much. So we love Saskatoon Berry Jam, but we don't like Jam. So I'm going to read this. I'm a bit nervous about reading because I don't read so good. So bear with me, okay? Letter to Sir John A. Macdonald. Dear John, I'm still here in Half-Breed. All of these years, you're dead. Funny thing, that railway you wanted so badly, there was talk a year ago of shutting it down, and part of it was shut down, the Dayliner at least, from sea to shining sea. And you know, John, after all that shuffling us around to suit the settlers, we're still here in Métis. We're still here after Meech Lake, and one no good for nothing Indian holding up the train, stalling the cabin syllables, nouns of settlement, steel syntax, and the long sentence of exploitation. And John, that goddamned railroad never made this a great nation, because the railway shut down and this country is still quarreling over unity, and Riel is dead. But he just keeps coming back in all the Bill Wilsons yet to speak out of turn to a favor, because you know as well as I that we were railroaded by some steel tracks that didn't last, some settlers who wouldn't settle, and it's funny, we're still here and calling ourselves half-breed.
Mm, mm.
Very
Good
powerful
reading,
political. Oh,
Very
thanks.
Yeah.
I added a lot of stuff to that. So.
You've been practicing.
In front of the mirror.
There's some powerful stuff in this week's lesson, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
A lot to take away.
Yeah.
We just have to thank like our amazing guest today, Shalene Jobin, like adding so much to this conversation. You're wonderful. Can't believe the people we get to work with. It's really quite stunning.
Yeah.
So next week, speaking of stunning, we don't know if we have the guest yet, but if we get the guest that we want, what do you have to say about him, Paul? What did you say?
Oh, he's so handsome. You guys are gonna love
so
him.
Handsome.
His beautiful hair.
Now we're looking for ratings grabs.
His hair really rivals Dan and Paul's hair. Yeah, for sure. And he's also brilliant, so that's a good thing. So
who is he?
Very brilliant.
He's brilliant, importantly. So it's lesson 8 and it's sovereign lands.
It's Adam Gaudry, Dr. Adam Gaudry, hopefully.
Hopefully. We haven't asked him. Jeez.
Oh, we haven't asked him. Sorry. Just so
if
excited.
You're watching, Adam, could you please be on our show now?
That's not very consensual.
Anyway, thank you. Thanks for this, Shalene. It was wonderful to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shalene. And obviously, Dr. Paul, Dr. Tracy, thank you as always for your time and your generosity. We so appreciate it. And for all of you who are wondering, where did my question go? Hopefully we will work it into some other conversations that we have down the line. But sometimes, when conversation takes you somewhere, you got to run with it. And also, I think it's important. I'll try and put together, and we'll work on this in terms of obviously further reading. But I do think it would be great to put a list together of some artisans and people and oh, there we go. Oh, we have books. Now we're just holding books up. Oh my goodness.
We'll put them on. Sarah will help us out.
All of these will be put. Oh my God. Well, we need to invite Shalene back just to go through all these books that she has on her desk.
Yes.
Oh my God. Well, we'll put them down, and also hopefully a list of things you can buy. Indigenous owned products or objects or art that maybe can help steer you in the right direction if you're thinking of investing your money. Obviously, this goes without saying, forever grateful for these conversations. And until next week, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Shalene.
Yes,
Thanks,
thank you.
Shalene.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, Dan.
Bye.